There never was a man with such a sense of responsibility and duty, and the agony of leaving his job undone, losing the other lives, and leaving me uncared for, must have been unspeakable.
The Terra Nova expedition, 1910 to 1913, is arguably the most heroic endeavor of the past 100 years. The expedition made many discoveries and explored lands never before seen by mortal man. However, their accomplishments would never have come to pass had it not been for their predecessors of Antarctic exploration. Up until the 20th century, man had not set foot on either pole of the earth. It was not long before this date that many persons scoffed at the existence of a great southern continent, or Terra Australis Incognita. This thought process led to the invention and popularity of the hollow earth theory. However, many men of science could not accept such flights of fancy and set out to discover what truths actually lie to the south of civilization. The first man to do so is a very famous British explorer by the name of James Cook. Cook, although having a reputation for perfecting an anti-scorbutic diet and inventing the marine chronograph, is chiefly remembered today as being the first man to penetrate the Antarctic Circle on the 17th of January, 1773. In 1819, a Russian expedition, led by Bellinghausen, discovered the first certain land in Antarctica. It was named Alexander Land, which lies nearly due south of Cape Horn. In February of 1841, James Clark Ross discovered an active volcano and an extinct neighbor. The Erebus and Terror, respectively, were named after the two ships of Ross's voyage. In 1897, Borchgrevink was the first to survive an Antarctic winter. He had built a hut at Cape Adare and conducted a great deal of scientific work. From 1901 to 1904, Scott made his first journey to the Antarctic in the Discovery. Edward Wilson and Ernest Shackleton accompanied Scott on this voyage. The group attempted to reach the South Pole and turned back at 82 degrees, 16 minutes south. The lessons of polar sledging were learned at a terrible cost. In 1909, Shackleton himself got together an expedition and sailed south in the Nimrod. Bad conditions and scurvy forced him to turn back only 97 miles from the geographical South Pole. The first leg of Scott's journey began when the Terra Nova, a dependable Dundee whaler of 750 tons with extravagant coal consumption, left Cardiff on the 15th of June, 1910.
I admit that the main object of the expedition is to reach the South Pole, but this is largely a matter of sentiment. If we drop our Antarctic work, in which England leads the world, the Americans will take it up and the stars and stripes will fly there instead of the Union Jack.
Ponting, who was standing beside Scott, wondered what their homecoming would be like, and Scott answered,
"I don't care much for this sort of thing. All I want is to finish the work we began in the Discovery. Then I'll get back to my job in the Navy."
Due to a large deficit in funding, Scott was not able to join his men on the initial journey to New Zealand, and was forced to partake in a whirlwind campaign to raise as much money as possible for the expedition. Although the trip to New Zealand was not very eventful, much scientific work was accomplished during this time, especially concerning seabirds and their parasites. The ship and its crew must first travel the distance between England and New Zealand over the next 3 months, testing equipment, provisions, stores, and patience before the final journey southward. The route taken offered as much safety as could be afforded by a wooden vessel. Starting from England, the ship rounded the Iberian Peninsula and then made for Brazil. It was here that the ship conducted a good deal of research on South Trinidad Island. Due to the island's unwelcoming coastline and hostile creatures, the island had remained uninhabited. A day was spent collecting specimens of all shapes and sizes, birds, insects, plants, spiders, and all living creatures. However, the island does not willingly give up its secrets. The millions of carnivorous land crabs would easily have removed any man were he to fall. The crabs even had a habit of attacking and eating the leather boots that the men wore. Upon attempting their return to the Terra Nova, a large swell made the journey very difficult. Horrendous waves thoroughly soaked all of the guns, ammo, clothes, and specimens in salt water. The entire scientific staff worked non-stop for the next 24 hours in order to save and preserve as many samples as Providence would allow. When all was said and done, about 80% of the specimens were still usable. After making the stop at South Trinidad Island, the ship continued on towards the Cape of Good Hope and then to Western Australia. It was here that Scott momentarily relieved Lieutenant Evans of his command and joined the crew. During the short time spent traveling to Melbourne, Scott made a thorough appraisal of his crew and decided who would be landing in Antarctica and who would be in which party. Upon landing at Melbourne, Scott was quite startled and disheartened to find a telegram from Amundsen, who was soon to become their biggest obstacle. The telegraph was from Madeira and dated the 9th of September, 1910. It simply stated,
"Am going Antarctic, Amundsen."
Scott and much of the public resented the fact that Amundsen's intentions appeared secretive in nature and quite underhanded. This note let Scott know that there truly was going to be a competitor for title of first at the pole. Thus, now knowing that there was an imminent threat to the prestige of both king and country, Scott went on another begging campaign throughout Australia and New Zealand. Upon the Terra Nova's arrival at Lyttelton, the ship was given a complete overhaul before heading south. Leaks were fixed and the cargo was completely restowed to make use of every available inch. The note sent by Amundsen was a crushing blow to the morale of the crew, and rightly so. For at the time, Roald Amundsen was the most famous and accomplished explorer throughout the world of the 1899 Belgica expedition, which was led by Adrian de Gerlach. Having set foot on Antarctic soil years before Scott, Amundsen believed that Norway should rightly have first claim for the pole. In 1906, Amundsen realized the dreams of centuries of explorers when he successfully traversed the Northwest Passage. It was shortly after his return to Norway that he began preparations to drift across the North Pole and explore the surrounding basin in the unmistakable Fram, which was no stranger to Arctic work. Like his previous expedition, Amundsen had ambitions of being the premier explorer, specifically planting the flag of Norway at the North Pole. However, his dreams of Arctic glory were crushed in September of 1909 when news came back that Peary, an American explorer, had claimed the pole. To prevent the financiers of his expedition from revoking their funds, Amundsen assured them that the voyage would be purely scientific and not concerned with record-breaking. Due to the fact that Amundsen was deeply in debt, he knew that only a spectacular triumph would allow him to repay his creditors. Thus, through desperation and resolve, Amundsen secretly turned his gaze southward.
If at this junction I had made my intention public, I would only have given occasion for a lot of newspaper discussion, and possibly have ended in the project being stifled at its birth. Everything had to be got ready quietly and calmly.
Amundsen did not even tell his men that they would be making a run for the pole until after they left Madeira. Once set off from civilization, Amundsen's confidence clearly showed through.
The British expedition was designed entirely for scientific research. The pole was only a side issue, whereas my extended plan, it was my main objective. The English have loudly and openly told the world that skis and dogs are unusable in these regions, and that fur clothes are rubbish. We will see. We will see.
When the Terra Nova left New Zealand, the ship was terribly overloaded. The sea was several feet above the maximum load mark, which made the vessel greatly at danger of capsizing. Among the massive amount of cargo were 2.5 tons of petrol, 33 Greenland dogs, 19 Siberian ponies, and 3 experimental motor sledges. Although the provisions mentioned were important, nothing caused Scott or the crew so much consternation and misery as the 455 tons of coal taken aboard for the southern journey. On the 2nd of December, in about latitude 52 degrees south, the Terra Nova ran headlong into a terrible squall and great difficulties befell them. It was not long before the lashings were torn loose and the deck cargo was thrown fore and aft. As water rose in the ship, coal sacks began to float and became battering rams that destroyed packing cases and were very hazardous to the men. Scott ordered many of the bags to be tossed over so that further damage did not occur. During this time, the ship was listing terribly in either direction, often dipping 50 degrees to one side or the other. None had it worse than the animals, though. The motion of the ship was so great that the ponies could barely stand. But it was the dogs, lashed to the deck and being battered by every wave, that had the most pitiable situation. Once the gale had passed, one horse had died and one dog had been washed overboard. The crew was very exhausted, but all were happy to come out of the storm with their lives. Cherry Garrard was quoted as saying,
"God has shown us the weakness of man's hand, and it was enough for the best of us."
The crew experienced smooth sailing from this point until the 9th of December in latitude 65 degrees 5 minutes south, when they entered the pack. The Terra Nova encountered the floating pack ice farther north than any previous expedition. For the next 3 weeks, the ship had to be shoved and bashed through a massive amount of ice, consuming a great deal of precious coal in the process. The ship was often brought to a complete stop by the massive sheets of ice that floated north each year. During these times, the men would often bring ice on board to replenish their fresh water supply. This is known as icing ship. On the larger floes, Dmitri and Mirs were able to give the dogs much needed exercise. This time was one of extreme productivity for the biologist due to the great abundance of animal life that inhabits the pack ice and southern oceans. Among the many types of animals in the pack ice, penguins, whales, and seals, not to mention a large amount of diatoms, were of great interest. Although most members of the crew enjoyed the downtime which the ice provided, these stops were particularly irksome for Scott. On each halt, he had to carefully gauge whether or not the ship would be immobile for more than 24 hours or less than 24 hours. The concern was always coal efficiency. If a wait of less than 24 hours, the fires would be banked, meaning maintained at a minimum level, which would burn through 2 tons of coal per day. If more than a day, the fires would be put out. To reheat the boilers after fires are put out, a dead loss of 2 tons is required. Thus, deciding what to do with the boilers was always uncertain. On December 30th, Scott wrote,
"We are out of the pack at length, and at last one breathes again."
On the 2nd of January 1911, 73 degrees 5 minutes south, 173 degrees 41 minutes west, the glorious Mount Erebus came into view. Mount Erebus dominates the coastal landscape and rises to a height of over 13,000 feet. It is the only active volcano within the Antarctic Circle. The eastern party climbed to the lowest crater at 12,500 feet.
While 2 of us were still there, an eruption occurred and we were sickened by poisonous fumes and pelted with blocks of lava so gaseous that one could pick up blocks of pumice as big as oneself. We intended to descend the first 3,000 feet of snow slopes by sliding on the seats of our trousers, breaking with ice axes as we went. It didn't quite work out like that. After 500 feet, we passed over a ridge of well-camouflaged, sharp rocks and slid the remaining 2,500 feet without the seats of our trousers, a feat not to be recommended in temperatures well below zero with a lazy wind.
Originally, the crew had planned to winter at Cape Crozier, but the seas were far too rough, so McMurdo Sound was chosen as their base of operations. During the time that all of the stores were being unloaded from the ship, close danger and misfortune stalked the crew members. On the 6th of January, 6 or 7 orcas were skirting the fast flow ice next to where the ship was anchored. Ponting, the photographer of the expedition, hurried to try and get some cinema of the beasts when
the whole floe under him and the dogs heaved up and split into fragments. One could hear the booming noise as the whales rose beneath the ice and struck it with their backs.
The orca, or killer whale, is quite vicious and is perhaps the largest physical threat to life in Antarctic waters at this time. He shall be a constant companion for all barrier sledging journeys. Grave disappointment befell the camp shortly after this when, as the motor sledges were being unloaded, one of the 3 motor sledges plunged through the ice, never to be seen again. It took a week for all stores to be landed and the hut to be erected. It was here that the 27 members of the main party could get things organized for the depot journey, not to mention the incredible amount of scientific work to be done. Of course, there were many penguins and sea birds near Cape Evans, but none offered more entertainment than the curious Adelie. Every now and again, the men would play a game with them known as the penguin trot. On January 24th, the time had come to start laying depots for the journey south the following summer. The depot-laying party got away with all the dogs and 8 ponies across the glacier tongue and on to the great ice barrier. The farther south that they could lay provisions, the easier their trip would be the next year. Traveling eastward to Cape Armitage with ship and stores to be depoted, Scott and his men investigated the old Discovery hut. All were quite enraged to find that Shackleton, who had used the hut on his recent voyage, had left a window open and the entire inside was one large ice cube. Shortly after establishing safety camp at 77.55 degrees south, the ponies began to falter in the harsh Antarctic conditions. It is quite a blessing that Scott did not place much importance on their help during the polar journey. 3 horses were in a particularly bad stretch. At Camp 11, Scott decided to send them back, along with Edgar Evans, Ford, and Keohane, and then to push on with the remaining 5. Conditions steadily worsened. On the 14th of February, with heavy snow and whirling drifts, Weary Willie, led by Gran, was preyed upon by a dog team as he struggled in the deep snow. On the 17th of February, Scott decided to end his sledging journey early and turn back, before he had reached the critical 80th parallel, at 79 degrees 28.5 minutes south, 142 miles from Hut Point. It was here that they built a cairn and deposited more than 1 ton of stores. This would become the famed 1-ton depot. On the 4th day of the return trip, 12 miles from safety camp, Wilson saw Mears and Scott's dogs disappear, one after another.
Exactly like rats running down a hole, only I saw no hole. They simply went into the white surface and disappeared.
The sledge hung precariously on the edge of a crevasse, while 11 dogs were left dangling in the abyss, howling and struggling. 2 dogs had broken from their harness and lie 65 feet below. Scott personally went down and hauled them out. On the way back to Hut Point from the depot laying, Scott, Oates, Gran, Bowers, Crean, and Cherry Garrard were camped on the sea ice when it broke up around them. It was the poor performance of the ponies that day which prompted Scott to state,
"Of course, we shall have a run for our money next season, but so far as the pole is concerned, I have little hope."
The men struggled for hours trying to save themselves and the ponies as killer whales circled around them, jumping from floe to floe as they momentarily touched. One pony would slip and fall back into the water with each attempt, and when the killer whales closed in, Bowers shouted,
"I can't leave him alive to be eaten by those whales."
He then grabbed the ice axe and drove it into its brain. When all was said and done, only 2 ponies had survived out of the 8 they had started with. Scott's expedition was greatly concerned with scientific findings above all else. This is clearly displayed by the fact that 6 men, led by Lieutenant Campbell, undertook 2 years of geographical and scientific exploration. After seeing off the depot party, the Terra Nova had sailed along the barrier as far as King Edward VII Land in hopes of finding a suitable landing spot for the eastern party, but no suitable place was found. Steering back westward in hopes of discovering a spot, the crew stuck closely to the land. Campbell knew of a suitable landing site in the Bay of Whales that he had discovered 2 years earlier with Shackleton. Upon sailing into the Bay of Whales, the crew discovered a ship anchored to the ice, which they immediately recognized as the Fram. The British expedition spent the better part of a day with the Norwegians. Scott's men were continually amazed with Amundsen and his winter quarters. Amundsen's wintering crew consisted of 9 men, a strict routine, and fantastic food, including preserves, cheese, California tinned fruits, and pastries, not to mention a sauna. Amundsen was a shrewd businessman that demanded efficiency. This was clearly seen with his mastery and management of dogs. After conversing, Amundsen reported that his attempt for the pole would not take place until the following Antarctic summer. Amundsen's camp at the Bay of Whales was at a very dangerous site, as his entire outfit could easily be out to sea if the ice were to break up, which it often did. In light of this danger, the bay was 60 miles closer to the pole than McMurdo Sound. This put Amundsen a whole degree nearer to the pole than Scott. He turned to Cape Evans to warn Scott and the others. Upon reaching Cape Evans, the team discovered that the bay ice had gone out and they were forced to swim the ponies ashore. This was a very dejecting experience, as the ponies were miserable and covered in ice. But after some rest and half a bottle of brandy, the ponies were 100% hale and hearty. Upon leaving a note for Scott, the Eastern Party continued on their own search for suitable winter quarters. They ended up settling on a narrow patch of sand that was constantly swept with winds of over 100 miles per hour. This was their home for nearly a year, and it was from this team that much of the scientific data brought back by the Terra Nova was unearthed. Much like the other parties, penguins and seals were the main entree, which, as well as providing blubber for lamps and cooking, were of great importance to the world of parasitology. The little Adelie penguins provided the men with many hours of entertainment as well. Once their requisite year was concluded at Cape Adare, the team was picked up by the relief ship and then deposited at Terra Nova Bay, where they would conduct a geological study for the next 6 weeks. After this, the ship was to pick them up, but the ship was never to be seen again. The crew was marooned for the winter with 1 month's provisions, summer clothes, light tents, and, if they survived, a 250-mile journey to save themselves. The team decided to winter on an island which was studded with hollow boulders, and survived in a tiny cave for 7 months. The crew was forced to subsist off of 2 meals a day throughout the winter, and were terribly emaciated. The crew even had the misery to come down with a terrible case of food poisoning during the winter. When they were finally able to leave the cave and start for safety, only 4 men could pull. 1 walked beside the sledge, and 1 had to be carried. At first, their rations only permitted 2 hot meals a day. However, after they crossed the Drygalski ice tongue, overeating of seal and other stores became the enemy. Early in November, all 6 men arrived at Hut Point with the greatest health any had experienced in years. Upon the completion of the Diepelang journey, the news of Amundsen's intrusion startled and disheartened Scott, which left him saying,
I don't know what to think of Amundsen's chances. If he gets to the pole, it must be before we do, as he is bound to travel fast with dogs and is certain to start early. On this account, I decided at a very early date to act exactly as I should have done had he not existed. Any attempt to race would have wrecked my plan, beside which it doesn't appear to be the thing that one is out for. You can rely on me not saying or doing anything foolish, only you may be prepared for finding our venture much belittled. After all, it is the work that counts, not the applause that follows.
On the 23rd of April, the sun vanished for the last time until August. During the long Antarctic winter, much intricate work was done by all members of the party. Scott spent nearly all of his working hours poring over the many details of the ensuing journey to the pole. All details of measures, weights, food rations, and distances were intricately planned to within a 2% margin of error. The biologist Edward Wilson spent much of his time over the winter adding color to the many illustrations that he had made throughout the summer. Fellow zoologists found many new species of fish and parasites. Perhaps the most intriguing find was the discovery of hundreds of tiny wingless insects when a large rock was overturned. Herbert Ponton, who said that he would gladly have filmed for the 24 hours of every day if sleep had not intervened, was unable to film in the months of darkness and could only take still photos by light of the torch. Mr. Cherry Garrard, to whom the world owes a great deal for sharing his fantastic account, spent his leisure hours writing and editing a small newsletter known as the South Polar Times. The geologists discovered that there were great deposits of coal and copper all throughout the Antarctic mountains around Cape Evans. During the long winter, Titus Oates had a terrible scare with one of the ponies. With only 10 ponies left for the pole journey, the crew could not stand to lose one. Thus, all effort was put forward to ensure that the pony survived. One pony, Bones, was in a very bad way. In the middle of July, he went off of his food and was soon racked with spasms.
Every now and again he attempted to lie down, and Oates eventually thought it was wiser to allow him to do so. Once down, his head drooped until he lay at length, every now and then twitching with the pain, and from time to time raising his head and even scrambling to his feet when it became intense. I don't think I ever realized before how pathetic a horse could be under such conditions.
The misery was caused by a partly digested ball of fodder and tapeworms. This would not be so terrible, except that a section of the animal's intestine had come out with the forage. There was also much work done by the meteorologists. Every week a large silk balloon was sent into the atmosphere with a tiny recording device that was usually released between 2 and 3 miles of altitude. Many times the device was never found. Considering all the hardships of Antarctica, life at Cape Evans during the winter was rather peaceful and enjoyable. That is, except for 3 brave and hardy souls who decided to go on a sledging journey in the name of science. It was early July 1911 that E.A. Wilson, Cherry Garrard, and Bowers started their perilous journey to Cape Crozier in search of emperor penguin eggs, which have never before been found and would be of great importance to the scientific community. These 3 men sledged on perhaps the worst journey in the world. The wind was horrendous, and the temperature never rose above -40 degrees Fahrenheit, with a low of around -70 degrees Fahrenheit. The men often prayed for the comfort of -50-degree temperatures.
We had bad winds at Cape Evans this year, and we had far worse the next winter when the open water was at our doors. But I had never heard or felt or seen a wind like this. I wondered why it did not carry away the earth.
The crew set out from their base with 2 9-foot sledges that were pulled in tandem, which doubled their friction and gave the men a ghastly time. The total sledge weight was 759 pounds, which equals 253 pounds per man. Marching in pitch darkness was terribly difficult and gave the men many frights as they fell into crevasses and pressure along the coast. However, the worst times were had when the surface became extremely difficult and they were forced to relay the two sledges, which means that for every geographical mile gained, 3 statute miles are traveled. This relay work was often done by candlelight if possible, for great winds often harassed them. Frostbites and frozen feet were a daily occurrence. The men would receive terrible blisters of immense size that ran the length of their burns. On marches, these blisters were the first things to freeze, and caused a great deal of pain. Their gear became iced up and frozen stiff in a matter of minutes, both inside and outside of the tent. So bad was it that each man had to scramble into a tolerable sledging position before his harness and gear was frozen in that position. The team was averaging an advance of 2 miles for every 8-hour period. Camp work itself was extremely slow and consumed 9 hours of every 24-hour period. Sleep was often elusive, but Wilson demanded that they all stay in their reindeer bags for 7 hours. On top of all this, the team was running a massive experiment on different sledging rations, which resulted in one getting more fat, protein, or starch than the other. This led to inconsistencies in pulling and much change in diet along the route.
Such extremity of suffering cannot be measured. Madness or death may give relief, but this I know, we on this journey were already beginning to think of death as a friend.
The trio was able to take a great number of meteorological and magnetic readings during this trip, not to mention securing 3 emperor penguin eggs for study, which was a terribly difficult feat in itself. Having endured 6 weeks of constant night and unheard of temperatures, the weary travelers returned with only minor injuries. The sun returned on the 23rd of August. Scott fixed the date of departure for the pole as the 1st of November 1911 at the latest. They could not start earlier as the ponies could not survive the cold. 1 month before the journey south began, a great number of mishaps befell the camp. 3 men were incapacitated, 2 ponies were doing terribly, and another dog died of a mysterious disease. Scott wrote,
"It is trying, but I am past despondency. Things must take their course."
On the 1st of November, the time had finally come for Scott to embark on the epic southern journey. The distance from Hut Point to the pole and back was 1,766 geographical miles. Every step of the way had to be marched on foot with or without skis. It was decided to travel during the night so that the ponies could rest in warmer temperatures. The motor sledges started first, pulling heavy loads, but were stopped a few days out due to mechanical failure. No doubt they would have been of greater success had the men more parts and greater testing. The dog teams started second, with the men and ponies following a day behind. The ponies had quite a fright when Victor caught his nostril on Snatcher's harness. This caused him to lose a large chunk of skin and run wildly back to the hut. It was a very bloody ordeal, but little actual damage occurred. On the 5th of December, the team awoke to a terrible blizzard. The temperature normally rose shortly before and during a blizzard, but in this case the temperature rose exceptionally high, which resulted in all gear and personnel becoming soaked and quite miserable. Scott wrote,
"One cannot see the next tent, let alone the land. What on earth does such weather mean at this time of the year? It is more than our share of ill fortune, but the luck may turn yet."
This blizzard confined the explorers to their tents for the next 4 days, greatly eating away at their valuable stores of food and fuel. The blizzard laid down a thick layer of snow across the Beardmore Glacier and the Antarctic Plateau, which stuck to the sledge runners and made traveling even a short distance very difficult. They had to constantly be scraped during halts to momentarily improve their glide. Once set off after the blizzard, the ponies showed greatly of being plain done. The beasts struggled on for 11 hours, after which time 5 ponies were shot, skinned, and made into a depot. Wilson wrote,
"Thank God the horses are now all done for, and we begin the heavier work ourselves."
2 days later found the explorers at the foot of the treacherous Beardmore Glacier, which is where they had originally planned to depot the horses. Shortly after ascending the glacier, an afternoon was spent fitting the sledges with shorter runners that would cause less friction. It was on this day that Petty Officer Evans badly cut his hand. Scott was constantly checking his progress against Shackleton's attempt for the pole in 1909, where he turned back 95 miles from the pole. Scott was quite pleased on the day that they had caught up Shackleton's dates. At 87 degrees 32 minutes south, the final returning party, consisting of Lieutenant Evans, Lashley, and Crean, set off, leaving Robert Scott, Edward Wilson, Henry Bowers, Lawrence Oates, and Petty Officer Edgar Evans to push on towards the pole. It was decided rather hastily at the last moment to make the polar journey with 5 men, instead of 4 which had been planned for. This made many difficulties for the men upon returning from the pole.
I cannot describe the maze we got into and the hairbreadth escapes we have had to pass through today. The more we tried to get clear, the worse the pressure got. At times it seemed almost impossible for us to get along, and when we had got over the places it was more than we could face to try and retreat. So we struggled on for hours to try and free ourselves, but everything seemed against us.
17th of January, 1912. During January, Lieutenant Evans' health steadily declined until they
gave him a little brandy and some chalk and opium pills to try and stop it. His legs are getting worse, and we are quite certain he is suffering from scurvy. At least he is turning black and blue and several other colors as well.
29th of January.
This morning we were forced to put Mr. Evans on his ski and strap him on, as he could not lift his legs. I looked at them again and found that they are rapidly getting worse. If we can get to 1 ton and get a change of food, we may relieve him. Mr. Evans on the sledge makes it pretty heavy work for both of us, but he says he is comfortable now. This morning he wished us to leave him, but this we could not think of. We shall stand by him to the end, one way or the other. I started to move Mr. Evans this morning, but he completely collapsed and fainted away. Crean was very upset and almost cried, but I told him it was no good to create a scene, but put up a bold front and try to assist. I really think he thought Mr. Evans had gone, but we managed to pull him through. We told Mr. Evans of our plans, which were, Crean should proceed, it being a splendid day, on foot to Hut Point to obtain relief if possible.
18th of February. Crean made the journey of 30 miles to Hut Point in record time and quickly dispatched Dr. Atkinson and Dimitri with the dogs to save the invalid. After much worry, all of the men and dogs arrived safely back at the hut on the 22nd of February. After parting company with the others, the pole party went on with high hopes of claiming the geographical South Pole for England. However, such hopes were soon forgotten as, on the 16th of January 1912, the team was quite startled and disheartened to find a black flag only a day's march from the pole.
This told us the whole story. The Norwegians have forestalled us and are first at the pole.
On the next day, a force 5 gale struck the men, along with temperatures falling to 54 degrees of frost. Oates, Evans, and Bowers all suffered from severe frostbites, as Scott wrote.
Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority.
The 18th of January found the men marching 7 miles south-southeast to the pole, where they raised their poor slighted Union Jacks. Scott wrote,
We've turned our backs on the goal of our ambition with sore feelings, and must face 800 miles of solid dragging, and goodbye to most of the daydreams. Great God, this is an awful place.
The journey from the pole back to McMurdo Sound was one of great misery and agonizing hardships that was daily compounded by terrible surfaces and even worse weather.
Things looking very black indeed. All the morning we had to pull with our strength, and in 4.5 hours we covered 3.5 miles. We are about 42 miles from the next depot, and have a week's food, but only about 3 to 4 days' fuel. We are as economical of the latter as we possibly can be, and we cannot afford to save food and pull as we are pulling. We are in a very tight place indeed. But none of us is despondent yet, or at least we preserve every semblance of good cheer. Providence to our aid.
Throughout all of these hardships, though, Scott and his crew spent an afternoon collecting 30 pounds of geological samples near the pole, which Scott refused to leave behind. During one of these awful marches, the crew ran into terrible crevasses, which were extraordinarily deep. During a fall down one of these crevasses, Petty Officer Evans received a concussion. However, his companions remained oblivious to his condition for quite some time. Shortly after descending the Beardmore Glacier, the first great tragedy befell the crew.
The weather cleared and we got away for a clear run to the depot, and had gone a good part of the way when Evans found his ski shoes coming off. He was allowed to readjust and continue to pull, but it happened again and then again, so he was told to unhitch, get them right, and follow on and catch us up. He lagged far behind till lunch, and when we camped we had lunch, and then we went back for him, as he had not come up. He had fallen, and had his hands frostbitten. And we then returned for the sledge and brought it and fetched him on it as he was rapidly losing the use of his legs. He was comatose when we got him into the tent, and he died without recovering consciousness that night, about 10 p.m.
Bowers, the 17th of February. Sadly, the strongest man of the expedition had been first to perish. At various depots along the way, Scott continued to find crippling shortages of fuel, which was caused by the leather washers contracting too much in the cold and allowing evaporation to occur. Sledging temperatures on the barrier that season were particularly low and turned out to be 20 degrees colder than average, oddly enough, an El Niño year. This put an added strain on the men who were already suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion, not to mention early signs of scurvy.
Tragedy all along the line. At lunch the day before yesterday, poor Titus Oates said he couldn't go on. He proposed we should leave him in his sleeping bag. That we could not do, and we induced him to come on the afternoon march. In spite of its awful nature for him, he struggled on, and we made a few miles. At night he was worse, and we knew the end had come. He slept through the night before last, hoping not to wake, but he woke in the morning, yesterday. It was blowing a blizzard. He said, "I am just going outside, and maybe some time." He went out into the blizzard, and we have not seen him since.
March 16th or 17th. The last camp was made on the 19th of March, a mere 11 miles from One Ton Depot. The next morning a blizzard raged outside the hut and prohibited them from moving on.
Since the 21st, we have had a continual gale from west-southwest and southwest. We had fuel to make 2 cups of tea apiece, and bear food for 2 days on the 20th. Every day we have been ready to start for our depot 11 miles away, but outside the door of the tent it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far.
Last entry.
Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale.
Letter to the public. It was not until the 12th of November that Surgeon Atkinson, leader of the search party, found their tent all but buried in snow. Although the crew had known that Scott must be dead due to the time of year, the entire crew was much shaken up by the discovery. Gran stated that
It was a horrid sight. It was clear that he had a very hard last minute. His skin was yellow, frostbites all over.
He continued, saying,
They died having done something great. How hard must death be having done nothing?
When Silas Wright pulled the flap aside, they saw the 3 men in their sleeping bags. On the left was Wilson, his hands crossed on his chest. On the right, Bowers, wrapped in his bag. It appeared that both had died peacefully in their sleep, but Scott was laying half out of his bag with one arm stretched towards Wilson.
We saw the mound of snow. We knew it was Scott's tent. I stayed outside. As a Norwegian, it was not my place. The others undid the tent flaps and went inside. Wilson was lying quite peacefully, his feet towards the entrance. Bowers, the other direction. Wilson had died peacefully. Scott was between them, half sitting up, one hand reached out to Wilson. Then I heard a noise, like a pistol shot. I was told this was Scott's arm, breaking as they raised it to take away the journals strapped under his arm. Scott had died dreadfully, his face covered with frostbite. We covered up the tent with snow and made a cairn on top. I shall never forget. We stood and sang Scott's favorite hymn, Onward Christian Soldiers.
Williamson said,
His face was very pinched, and his hands, I should say, had been terribly frostbitten. Never again in my life do I wish to behold the sight we have just seen.
Although Edward Adrian Wilson and Lieutenant Bowers gave their lives for this gallant endeavor, it was Scott who, at the age of 43, had been last to perish. Scott's death was not only his own, but arguably also marked the death of the heroic age of exploration. From this point forward, machines would continually edge out man's place in exploration.